Hello and welcome to the demonstrable power of free will. This is the second lecture in a series of 4 on the Rational Spirituality Crash Course, where we don't ask you to believe anything without evidence and we don't ask you to take anything on faith. Let's have a look at where we are in the course. So previously we did Unifying Science and Consciousness, where we understand the story of science and the story of consciousness. They don't fit together properly, and we had a really good look at that. If you get thrown or you're a bit unsure about some of the ideas that come up here that might refer to the first lecture, I definitely recommend you check it out first. But you might be alright just starting here. You'll have to see for yourself. Now we'll be looking at the demonstrable power of free will, which is quite a title. I'm essentially saying that free will has to exist, but I understand that there are people saying that it has to not exist. So we'll be looking at that. We'll be looking at the different definitions of free will that are used. We can use some definitions to argue it away because the definitions are bad. We will be looking at the case against free will. We will understand our intellectual opponents and the case to be made against free will. We will want to know what it is that makes people think that free will isn't real, and we want to take that very seriously. We want to steelman the opposition to free will. Then we will be looking at the case for free will. We will be looking at how, after making quite a devastating case against free will, that we can possibly get it back. Later in the course, we will be looking at Are We Trapped in the Matrix?, which will be an examination of our belief systems and metaphysics. And finally, we'll be looking at exceptional conscious experiences. Research into consciousness, which is at the edge of what we even consider acceptable from a scientific standpoint. And we'll be seeing if there's anything in it. Is this all just noise and rubbish, or is there some truth to be found? Defining free will. The first definition of free will that I'm going to use is the one of self-determination, which begs the question, what's the self? Most people seem to feel identical to a process in their mind. They bear witness to thoughts that they're having. They may feel identical to the thoughts, or they may have done meditation and they may see the thoughts as something that goes through their mind, but your consciousness, your mind, that is what most people would call the self. Your particular stream of consciousness. And we'll go with that. That's a good workable definition there. So the second definition of free will that we'll get to is this idea that you're not destined to keep making the same mistakes. You can change. And this is the kind or gentle interpretation of you could have done otherwise. So let's flesh that out with an example. Many years ago, I ended up having, I suppose you'd have to call it an affair. It wasn't with a married person, but I had, I went on a date with someone and we just got on with incredible chemistry. And after the date, I learnt that she'd got a boyfriend. And that just all went horribly wrong from there. The point that I'm trying to make is that I made a mistake, and it was a painful mistake, and I wouldn't want to repeat that mistake. As soon as I realised that that person wasn't available, I should have walked away and said, well, this is how I feel, but this is unacceptable to me. I'm going. I do not want to repeat that mistake. It was very painful. And I'm not destined to keep making the same mistakes. From having made it once, from having made that mistake once, I now know that I can do things differently, that I can do otherwise in the future. And that's a wonderful definition of free will. It's essentially just learning. All right, let's have a look at the third interpretation. This is you could have chosen otherwise, but really the harshest interpretation that we can come up with. This is you could have chosen to choose the choice that you didn't choose to pick. It's the notion that we could rewind the universe like it's a video cassette recorder, right? We can just spin back the tape. We can look at things 5 seconds ago, and then we can just have them play out again. Now, I should say that even if you frame it like that, you're automatically having the assumption baked in there that the universe is a linear process. It looks like it is, but it might not be. So this is built on an assumption. You could have chosen to choose the choice that you didn't choose to pick. Now, if you were asking me about free will and you wanted to stick with such an interesting interpretation of what the definition of free will was, it would look sneakingly to me like you just didn't want to acknowledge free will as a real thing. But I suppose we do have to take this definition seriously, though. There are ways that you can have free will even in this definition, but they essentially involve retrocausality, and I think we'll leave that to the fourth lecture of the series to dive into. Let's make the case now against free will. Let's look at the neuroscientific evidence. Let's look at the famous one, the one that everybody cites. Let's look at Libet's experiment. Libet asked people to keep an eye on a clock and then make a movement, make a free will movement whenever they felt like it. It was completely arbitrary. But whenever they decided to move, they were to make a note of the time on the clock. This would allow Libet to identify when the person had decided to make a movement. And while all this was going on, there's an electroencephalograph, an EEG, on the person's head so that brain readiness potentials can be observed. So we're just looking around in the brain for any activity that might give us a clue as to how this process unfolds. And what Libet found was that the readiness potentials happen before the report of deciding to do something. It looks in a normal cause and effect way like the tail's wagging the dog. It looks like the brain. The brain is the causal factor. The brain is making things happen, and the conscious report is happening later. And this to many essentially is the end of free will. This is the evidence that proves that there's no free will. And people have gone further. So this sort of experimental design's been expanded on. People can end up choosing between one thing or another thing. Whenever these decisions are arbitrary, though, whenever they're just asked to do one thing or another, the most compelling evidence is that we can detect which choice you're going to make 10 seconds before you know. That sounds pretty conclusive, doesn't it? It sounds very convincing. It sounds like the neuroscience says, well, we don't have free will. Another thing against free will is that we can't imagine how free will works. We can think of determinism, that things are determined, that you have cause and effect, and that the universe is essentially like a giant piece of clockwork. It's predictable. We know what it's going to do in advance. It's deterministic. And there's nothing about determinism that gets you the freedom to will one way or another. There's no choice in a clockwork universe. All right. What about randomness? Does randomness give us choice? Will quantum mechanics come to the rescue of free will? Well, if we see quantum mechanics only in terms of randomness, which might be a foolish thing to do, but let's say that we did it anyway. Let's say that we just think of things in terms of determinism and randomness. Is randomness going to give us that free will? Is randomness going to grant you agency? Are you in charge of how it plays out? Well, no, that's not how randomness works. Suffice it to say, whether we go through determinism or randomness, you don't get free will either way. So, it doesn't work. You can't have free will because we can't imagine how you could have free will. It doesn't make sense. And if you're really sharp, you'll notice we've just committed an incredulity fallacy. I can't believe how something could exist, therefore it doesn't. I can't believe how something could work, therefore it doesn't. I can't imagine how the moon goes round the earth. Oh, it doesn't. Nonsense, nonsense, nonsense. But anyway, let's carry on. The case against free will. One of the best things that the case against free will has is compassion for harmful people. Do murderers choose to murder? It's an interesting question, because if we have this classical understanding of free will, then people choose the things they do in life. And if they choose the things they do in life, they choose to be good or they choose to be bad. What if they didn't choose to be bad? What if that's something that we're projecting onto them? What if they'd really rather be good, but they're trapped? They can't get out of where they are. They are the victims, not just the perpetrators. What if that's true? If that's true and we're treating them like they make a choice, then we could be being incredibly unethical to them. We could be really being incredibly mean and very heartless of what they're going through. Of course, for us to be mean would mean that we'd have to be causal in the first place. That's a problem. But still, it stands. Do murderers choose to murder? It's an interesting point in the argument made against free will. Let's have a look now at the scientific problem. We have a very, very big problem with free will. In fact, if you believe that our current understanding of the physical known universe is pretty much there, that it's not seriously at fault in any way, if you think that we pretty much got it, then you can't have free will. You don't get free will. You're not allowed it. And I'll tell you why. Our current understanding is essentially that there is a sort of a bottom level of physics that we can really glimpse at the moment. Something like the standard model of particle physics or the quantum fields, something that we probably covered in lecture 1. And from that, chemistry, biology, the brain, and then the mind emerge one layer after another. These aren't new creations, they're not new things, they're just more complex patterns in the basic substructure that was always there. Ask what happens next in chemistry, and what you're really asking is, what does the physics say? Ask what happens next in biology, and what you're really saying is, well, what does the chemistry and the physics say? Ask what happens in the brain, and what you're really asking is, well, what does the biology say? What does the chemistry say? What does the physics say? It's all just this downwards flow to what we really regard as causal, what we really regard as making anything happen at all, which is physics. For us to have free will, we need that self-determination. We need that ability for you to make a choice. We need conscious experience to be able to select from more than one possible outcome. And how can it? We can't close the loop. Anyone studying this tends to come to the conclusion that free will must be an illusion. The self is completely emergent from physics and bears no autonomy. It's acausal. Seems somewhat devastating, doesn't it? But let's now examine the case for free will. So as we move into the case for free will, let's take another look at that neuroscientific evidence. When we looked at Libet's experiment, we were looking at arbitrary decisions. You don't really care which one comes out. You're not emotionally invested or interested from a conscious perspective as to whether you pick red or green or when you move your arm. It's an arbitrary decision. So the question they asked, or the question that was asked in people criticising this particular research was, well, what if there's a difference between an arbitrary action and a deliberate action? What if they don't actually work in the same way? What if our consciousness was almost saying, all right, brain, I don't really care which way this turns out. You make a decision and let me know when you've figured it out. It would be entirely consistent with what we've seen in Libet's experiment. So luckily, Mayos, Jaffe, Koch and Mudrik have examined this, and I'm not necessarily assuming that they're the first people to do so, although they might be, I'm not exactly sure, but it was the first paper I came across. This is where there is an examination of the difference between arbitrary choice and deliberate choice. And the question was going to be, what happened to those readiness potentials? When we make a deliberate choice, does it work the same way as the arbitrary choice? And the answer was no. From that particular study, there wasn't a sign of readiness potentials that were statistically significant or meaningful when deliberate choices were being made. And deliberate choices are also slower. So it would seem that it doesn't take a lot to debunk the idea that the neuroscience is only saying one thing on the free will question. And then we have to look at free will as a muscle. There's interesting research that's also going on at the moment where scientists are investigating whether free will has a price, whether we have so much of it a day, whether it's like a muscle that we can exercise and make stronger. Is it possible that we get so much ability to nudge things the way that we want them to go during the day and we become more passive after we've expended this mental energy to try and choose things for ourselves? And the evidence for that seemed to suggest that that was actually going on. And let's come back to the idea that we can't imagine how free will works. Let's look at that again. So what? So what? So what that we can't imagine it? Just because you can't imagine something doesn't mean it's not happening. If I don't understand how the moon goes around the Earth, will it stop it from doing that? And the answer is no. Well, if you don't understand how free will works, will it stop it from working? Well, if it's really a thing, no. Let's have a look again at that example for compassion for harmful people, because I think that was probably one of the best points that the case against free will has made. Do murderers choose to murder? Well, what if we took that neuroscientific research as it being a muscle? If it's a muscle, if free will is more like something that you have a certain amount of power of to do a day, and it can be weak or it can be strong, what if people who end up in terrible life choices simply haven't learnt to exercise their free will properly? What if they're having problems? We are exploring this nature of compassion without free will having to be an either-or prospect. I think that's interesting. Responsibility. So, I want us to imagine that in 10 years' time, we have automated cars. We have driverless cars. The cars use artificial intelligence to get from one place to another, or we can drive. We have a choice. And unfortunately, in this future, you find yourself in a car that's just killed a pedestrian. Is this your fault? Is this your responsibility? Well, were you driving? No, the car was. Okay, well, did you service it properly? Have you done your due diligence in looking after the car? Have you done everything that you should have done? Have you done it right? Okay, well, if the car was driving, then you're not responsible, are you? You can't be held responsible. If you've done everything right, you can't be held responsible for the way the car drives. Why? Because you're not in control of it. Let's say you were in control of it. Well, you would be responsible for the death then, wouldn't you? Maybe there are some mitigating circumstances. Maybe it's just an accident. We do understand that these things happen. It's never desirable. But it's something that is at least accepted. Well, what would make you more responsible? What would make you criminal in the eyes of the law? Well, what if you hadn't taken your responsibilities seriously? What if you were driving dangerously? What if you were intoxicated? Well, if either of these things were true, then you're very definitely responsible for that death. But you can't be responsible for the death if you're not the driver, can you? No, if you're not the driver and you're not the person who maintains the vehicle, if this is entirely done by other people and you've done nothing wrong, you've done nothing causal, then you can't be held responsible. And this is a problem. Without free will, without anyone determining their own actions, there is no such thing as responsibility. It's a meaningless concept. Let's have a look at rewards. So, think of something that you really love that you've achieved. Think of the biggest achievements of your lifetime. Maybe you've got some promotion at some point that you were really proud of. Maybe you did a really good job studying a particular course, or when you were at university, something like that. You feel entitled to the rewards of your efforts. But if you're not really making the effort, if it's all just an illusion, then there are no rewards. No one deserves anything. Nobody caused anything. No one's causal in this way of looking at the world. You don't get rewards. And in much the same way as you don't get rewards, you don't get apologies. Now, I find this really interesting because there's a particular channel, Actualized, with which is done by a guy called Leo. And he had one particular episode where he essentially said that there is no free will. There's no free will. And several episodes later, some time later, he has an episode where he said he apologised for the things that he'd done wrong. He was going through some sort of experience with that. And he apologised like he'd never apologised before. And the thing that sort of made me interested in that was that I thought to myself, oh, that's interesting, Leo. Has your thoughts on free will changed then? Well, this is the interesting thing. If you can't take responsibility for something because you're not causal, as in you've got no self-determination, if you've got no free will, how can you apologise for anything? How can it mean anything? It can't. You can't apologise for something that you haven't done. I think we all understand that. I mean, you can say that you're sorry that someone hears it, or you can even come out with the platitudes, but you can't truly be sorry for something that was completely outside of your control. That's not really how apologies work. So now, let's consider the absurdity of emotional acausality. Without free will, your feelings aren't real. We'll explain this. Let's consider romantic attraction with free will, and we'll start to paint a picture of what's going on here. I want you to think of a time where you've had a romantic pull to somebody, where you've had attraction to somebody, where you've wanted them, right? Good. Why is your human body trying to coerce you into an action with an emotion if you aren't a causal agent? What would we expect to see if you made real choices and the body wanted to influence those? The body would have to come up with a mechanism by which it would try and steer you one way or another to achieve an objective. It wants you to do something. It wants you to do something. How does your body make you do something? Or how does it play that out? Well, my experience of that is I have emotions. I have feelings. I don't just find myself doing stuff. I have a motivation. I have an emotional motivation to do something. I'm being coerced by my body into particular actions. But I don't mind that. I've got no problem with it. That's life. It's what I know. Now, I don't have to act on things. If I have a feeling of emotional attraction to somebody, I don't have to act on it. I'm not compelled. I'm not forced. I don't just find myself doing it. I have a choice, but I feel it. I know that's what my body wants me to do. I know that I feel compelled to do something. Let's look at the same situation without free will. How would this work? How would the world work if there were no free will with romantic attraction? Well, you wouldn't need emotions for a start, because emotions would be appealing to a powerless leader. What's the point? What's the point indeed? Surely you just find yourself doing it. You just find yourself in a relationship. You wouldn't feel the emotions of the relationship. You'd just find yourself doing it. Oh, here I am. This is going on. Oh, here I am. This is going on. You would just find yourself doing it. You'd find yourself compelled. You would just do stuff. You wouldn't have feelings. Romantic attraction without free will. Think about it. What would that be? Well, it wouldn't be attraction. There would be no coercing of your consciousness. You'd just be doing it. And it's worth noting that there are some things with regards to your body that you don't have free will over. If we give a reflex action, right? if I strike the tendon just underneath my kneecap without me doing anything, my knee goes whoop. That's a good example of me not having free will over that action. You can all test it. We all know it. That's not how romance works, though, is it? And here we get to the clincher. This is the best part of the lecture, in my opinion. We now look at thoughts originating from consciousness. The question is, why are we doing this? Every single one of our arguments against free will essentially suggests and postulates that it's really physics that's in control of everything. You can argue it lots of different ways, and you can talk about cause and effect and determinism and randomness, but what it really boils down to is the idea that everything is just coming from physics. So what we're interested in is if we could say that something is true, something that we can talk about and experience, if there is something that is not coming from physics, if there's something that's not coming from physics, then we've got a thought that may well be originating from consciousness. Does it come from consciousness? Is there a thought that comes from consciousness and that we couldn't make any sense of it coming out of physics? So what about the usual stuff, right? People will say things like, so John Searle says, mind over matter's obvious. I want to raise my arm, and the damn thing goes up. He usually gets a laugh for that. Well, people will argue against that, and they'll say, well, that was just part of a logical argument that you were making. It wasn't that you wanted to raise your arm just for the hell of it. There were reasons for it, and those reasons can be tracked back into lots of physical traces and causes. Oh, and that's the problem. I mean, it seems obvious to us. We raise our arm when we want to raise our arm, but what if we were just making a point? I mean, what would it look like just wanting to raise your arm? So that's a problem. And it's the same sort of thing as if you're hungry for food. I mean, it might seem like the hunger originates in consciousness, but we're pretty sure it doesn't. We're pretty sure that it actually originates in your body, and your body communicates to your consciousness that you're hungry somehow, and you have the sensation of being hungry, and that makes you look for food. It has this issue that when we track an event back, it always seems to come from the physical universe. The origin of any particular dispute looks like we could always lead it back to the Big Bang. Causality just looks like it tracks that way. Is there something that breaks from this? Yes, there is. there is indeed. So Sam said no to this question. Sam said, no, there is no thought that originates in consciousness. And he said that in 2012. 7 years later, his wife writes a book, Consciousness by Annika Harris. And in 2019, her book said that there is one thought that comes from consciousness and originates from consciousness and comes from nowhere else. I didn't get this idea from her. I'm not necessarily sure that she's claiming to have originated the idea either. This is an idea that is going around in philosophy, and it's something that occurred to me from looking at David Chalmers' work. It hit me and I was like, holy crap. Reporting consciousness. The meta problem of consciousness. If I tell you I have a mind, if I say, is mind over matter a real thing? And you say, well, what's mind? And I say, well, mind is what it is to be me. My mind is what I experience. It's what I feel. What you're really doing here is your consciousness describing your experience of yourself, your conscious self, out into the physical world. When we say, is there such a thing as mind over matter? The right answer should be something like, if there wasn't such a thing as mind over matter, we wouldn't be talking about mind in a material world. I'm proud of that one. So the meta problem of consciousness, this idea that there is something that comes from just consciousness, which is the report of what it is to be conscious. This changes things. This changes things a lot, because just by telling you that I'm conscious, and not because I was using it in some sort of way to try and argue something necessarily, but just because it's an honest report, just because I want to communicate it with you, that doesn't have an origin in the physical world of behaviour. It doesn't, because it's more than behaviour. And this is the meta problem of consciousness. Why is it that we're going around talking about consciousness? Which comes from the feelings and behaviour, or the behaviour versus feelings distinction that we talked about in Lecture 1, which is the hard problem of consciousness. Why is it that it feels like something to be us? As soon as we start talking about consciousness, this invisible property of brains, where it feels like something to be. As soon as we start talking about that in the physical world, it demonstrates its power over the physical world. If free will were really an illusion, you wouldn't have the self-determination to be talking about the self. So let's look at the scientific problem again. We had that issue that we went from physics, then we emerged chemistry from there, and biology is emergent from that, the brain is emergent from that, the mind is emergent from that. And we said that we can't close that loop. We can't have consciousness selecting what happens next. We can't have consciousness making a real choice in the world. But consciousness chose to talk about itself in the world. Oh dear. If you take that seriously, then this paradigm of how we see and understand the world, that everything's just emergent from the bottom up, is proven false. And thus, we have the demonstrable power of free will. Really, when we look at the scientific problem, what we're seeing is common sense versus physics. In common sense, you have choices. In common sense, you have responsibilities. In common sense, you deserve your rewards, and in common sense, you deserve your punishments. It's not quite quite fair to just say this is against physics. It's really against physicalism. If we say that everything is just physics, as physicalism does, then there is no responsibility. You are not causal. Everything is just physics. Clearly, the reality that we live in today, the truth of the matter is, in a way that we don't understand and don't comprehend, that we really are somehow having consciousness affecting what reality plays out. We wouldn't be talking about consciousness otherwise. So wrapping up, the definition of free will doesn't seem to be unanimously agreed upon. People who are for and against it can end up not even talking about the same thing. It might make more sense to explore what free will could be before trying to rule on whether it exists or not. Ideologies such as physicalism necessitate the elimination of all forms of conscious free will. Do concepts of free will result in us lacking compassion for criminals? So have we got something that's fundamentally right here and fundamentally correct, and are we misusing it to punish people? I'm not saying that people who do wrong shouldn't be punished, but I'm saying, are our instincts wrong? Should we be really trying to fix broken people rather than just trying to lambast them for not being as capable as we are at being responsible? And finally, we hit the nail on the head. If we can talk about subjectivity, that is the proof that we have an effect on physics. We close the loop. So, I'm very much aware that this lecture places itself on the definite side of an argument that's still quite controversial. And this is part of a course. What I'd love for you to do is to challenge my arguments and assumptions, for you to leave comments where you've got ideas and contributions and make them in a respectful and intelligent way. That's absolutely fine. I don't mind people also making a few jokes, but I just would like to keep this focused. I am hoping that this will inspire you to do more research around this area, to really consider the arguments that have been made here today seriously, and the arguments against the ideas that I present as well. So, that about wraps things up. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you next time as we delve into the question of, are we in the Matrix? Thank you.
Most people think consciousness is supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
We all have our own inner movie.
Consciousness is an amazing collection of sort of mundane tricks in the brain.
If nature is made of nothing but unconscious matter, how come we're conscious?
Consciousness is irreducibly subjective. Now that sense of being a subject, a locus of consciousness inside the head, is an illusion.